Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us tonight. My name is Kate Bruns, and on behalf of Harvard Bookstore, the Harvard University Division of Science, and the Cabot Science Library, I'm very pleased to welcome you to our program tonight with Richard Wrangham discussing his new book, The Goodness Paradox, The Strange Relationship Between Virtue and Violence in Human Evolution. In just a moment, I will turn you over to Andrew Berry of the Harvard Organismic and Evolutionary Biology Department. So now I will turn things over to Dr. Andrew Berry.
Thank you, and it is really a true pleasure and a privilege to introduce somebody I'm honored to call my friend, Richard Wrangham, who has written a beautiful book. I've actually read the damn thing, and it truly is eye-opening, and it truly is a tour of an enormous swath of intellectual territory. Richard, by training, is a primatologist, but he has bled over into anthropology, he's bled over into criminology this time, into sociology, into evolutionary genetics, into evolutionary biology. He is truly something of a Renaissance man. And this book now sounds like you've got different chapters on different topics going completely sort of eclectic, disparate, and messy. It's beautifully synthetic. It really is a beautiful piece of work. So I'm thrilled and excited to hear the presentation, to see if the talk, Richard, is as good as the book. You're going to have to, it's kind of a long book, so you're going to have to talk really fast. Richard is British, which is obviously a point in his favor. He was a graduate student with Robert Hine in Cambridge, the great ethologist, and worked from the get-go on chimpanzees in Gombe in Tanzania. This is working closely with Jane Goodall. So this is where Richard cut his teeth in chimpanzee primatology, and why not a whole bunch of other species, including most notably, subsequently, the bonobo, the pygmy chimpanzee. So Richard has traveled very broadly in the primatological niche. And one thing which is rather remarkable that he's done is in 1987, okay, Gombe, Jane Goodall et al., it's done. We know those chimps. We're pretty familiar with them. He recognized, not unreasonably, that having independent comparisons is a good idea. And so he commenced another grand primatological study. This was in Kibale in Uganda. Then in 1989, he came here. He had various august academic appointments in various places. Stanford and the other Cambridge come to mind. Came to here in 1989, where he has been ever since. He's the Ruth Moore Professor of Anthropology at the moment, has been for a while. In 1997, he did one of the things I think is one of the coolest of the many cool things he's done, which is he and Elizabeth Ross, his wife, initiated the Kasisi project. This is in Uganda. It's associated with the Kibale project. Now, if you're a field biologist studying your beloved organisms in the field, you inevitably confront issues of conservation. Your organisms are threatened. What Richard has recognized, Richard and Elizabeth have recognized, is you can't just wave your hands and say, save our chimpanzees. They've established this community-based project. It's education-focused, it's agriculture-focused. It's the whole holistic package to create a sustainable world in which the chimpanzees and the local communities can coexist profitably. Very briefly, Richard has published widely in all sorts of amazing fields. 2 books prior to this one. First one was with Dale Peterson on male aggression. Second one was a wonderful book, I thought, on the role of fire in shaping the evolution of Homo sapiens. Now Richard has got an even bigger picture, pull back the camera perspective on the evolution of our own species. And this is the goodness paradox. Welcome, Richard.
Many thanks to Andrew for those remarks, particularly the ones that were true. So thank you so much for coming out on this cold evening, and I hope the snow squall doesn't hit us while we're here. It's a thrill for me to be able to share what I think is a really exciting time in the study of human evolution. Things are moving fast because of what's happening in genetics, what's happening in neurobiology and physiology and all sorts of areas. And what I want to do is to share a new perspective on how we became human, as well as a problem of aggression. The paradox referred to in the title of my book is the fact that in comparison to other species, in many ways we are exceptionally non-violent. And yet, at the same time, we're also exceptionally violent. I will elaborate on that point. What it means is that we have a tussle between two kinds of views. One kind of view is represented by the Rousseauians, people who believe that they're following the precepts of Jean-Jacques Rousseau, which is the idea that our evolved tendency, our natural evolutionary psychology, places us for non-aggression. In that case, the reason that we are aggressive sometimes is that we are corrupted by society. And the other view is that we have an evolved natural tendency to be competitive and aggressive and violent in the style of Thomas Hobbes. And in that case, we are civilized by society. So if we have a single scale of aggression, there's paradox. Well, what are we doing lying at both ends of this? So that's one question I want to get to grips with. The other question may not seem at first to be closely tied, and that is that when we take the various species in the genus Homo, then why is it that one of them became us? So in order to get into that, I want to remind some of you about where we are in human evolution. So just to get a quick introduction to the pattern, here is the pattern of relationships among ourselves and the great apes as revealed by genetics. So since 1984, we've known this very surprising thing that humans emerge from within the tree that contains chimpanzees and bonobos and gorillas. And that indicates that our ancestor, which we can date to something like 7 to 9 million years ago, was in the chimpanzee, bonobo, gorilla mold. And various pieces of evidence suggest that it's rather more like a chimpanzee than anything else. And then we have 4 or 5 million years of ancestors who were called Australopithecines and are basically chimpanzees standing upright and with slightly bigger teeth. They're about chimpanzee-sized, and they were still probably sleeping in trees, and they've certainly got big brawny arms that enable them to do well in the trees. So the last point is the one I want to focus on, and this is the genus Homo. So the genus Homo begins something around 2 million years ago. It depends exactly how you define it. And the big picture is that most people would say that Homo erectus is the first sort of significant member of our genus. This is the one that could go into Harvard Square and pick clothes off the peg, and if you can find a clothes shop there. And unlike any other species. And then eventually, starting around 300,000 years ago, we have a species that we call Homo Sapiens, represented here, of course, by the erstwhile president of Harvard. And the big picture, it gets confusing when we go into the middle of this era, the 2 million years of the Pleistocene, because there's a bunch of species that we don't really have any sort of very clear understanding of exactly how they should be named, but they consist of a series of rather robustly boned and still quite big-brained species represented here by the president of Yale. So the question that I want to ask is, what happened about 300,000 years ago? And here is a representation of that early human by Elizabeth Dinez. I want to look at 3 things that changed about this time. First of all, there were some anatomical changes. On the left, what you see is the skull of an individual from about 600,000 years ago. And you see some extremely robust ridges above the eye, those brow ridges, which are becoming a little bit reduced by the time you get to the species that most people are now thinking represents a very early form of Homo sapiens at Jebel Uhud in Morocco. It's got lesser brow ridge, it's got a shorter face, it's got smaller molars, all of which are trends in the direction that is then sort of fully realized as Homo sapiens by, say, 200,000 years ago. And here you've got one of those early specimens with, by that time, a rounded brain case, which people used to think was defining Homo sapiens, and now is seen as coming in during Homo sapiens. Of course, these are just arbitrary definitions about names, but anyway, you get the sort of general trajectory here. So that's some of the anatomical changes. And then at the same time, we're getting some archaeological changes. Somewhere around 300,000 years ago, that's when you get this, what's been called a sleek new toolkit. And what that means is that instead of these rather crude hand axes on the left, you see a whole series of more subtle, smaller, more effective tools on the right, made by a new kind of technique that it demands a lot of foreplanning, the Lavallois technique. And at the same time, you're getting some evidence of larger social networks, either single groups occupying larger areas or more trade among groups, because the obsidian that is sourced in the particular study that showed this best at Logasile in Kenya can come from as much as 100 kilometers away, a very rare occasion before 300,000 years ago. And then some of you might be able to see on the bottom right stones a little bit of red, and now we're getting, for the first time, the symbolic representation, apparently, represented by the use of red ochre. So anatomy is changing, the archaeology is changing. Probably both of those things will prove to be pushed back a little bit earlier, because you never find the earliest things at any one time. And then at the same time, some of the genetic analysis is indicating this is the time when, if you look at all the genes of all the humans living today, they converge back around that same time. So the question that I want to ask in scene setting here is, what is it that was happening to Homo sapiens? Here is a representation over the 2 million years of human evolution, the genus Homo, of various species, and other authorities would give slightly different names to some of these species, but only one of them became Homo sapiens, and then bred a little bit with Neanderthals and Denisovans, but basically dominated the Earth. What is special about us? Well, the great physical anthropologist from Germany, who in Germany they say he is the father of physical anthropology, was Johann Friedrich Blumenbach. And he was quoted by Darwin as having a real interest in domestication. And he said, man is far more domesticated than any other animal. And this was not a chance remark. He repeated essentially a version of this probably a dozen times in his writings at different times. He was absolutely convinced that humans really are a domesticated animal. He was not an evolutionist. He wrote before Darwin, but he did think that probably a benign God had made us a domesticated species. And as you see at the bottom, many other people have had the same thought. And the essential reason for this is that wild animals tend to be relatively aggressive, and domesticated animals tend to be relatively calm and tolerant and cooperative with each other, cooperative in the sense of not being aggressive, and humans clearly fall into the latter category. And this turns out to be very true. For someone who studies chimpanzees, it's kind of dramatic. So here is an example of an observation made by two anthropologists who spent 17 years with the Ache foragers of Paraguay. And what they observed was that not once in that 17 years did they see so much as a scuffle among these men. Now, that's a slight exaggeration of what happens on average, but if you look at travelers' tales from the earliest contacts with all sorts of people around the world, or if you look at data nowadays from all sorts of people around the world, the same thing is true, which is that you can pack a lot of people into a room like this, or you can just observe them day by day, and if they were chimpanzees, they would probably have a squabble, and please don't behave like chimpanzees. But if you are just regular humans, then we are all very relaxed. Let me give you an illustration of the kind of thing we see, not exactly on a daily basis, but you're never surprised to see it on a daily basis in chimpanzees. It's happening all the time.
No, tira. Kuiva, no kuiva aqui. Mwana kawa kuiva.
So that is the reality of one of our closest relatives. And even bonobos have got quite a high frequency of aggression, even though they are less violent in their aggression. And if we do some sort of fairly rough approximations, you can say that the amount of scuffling, the amount of just regular fighting that goes on among chimpanzees compared to humans, it's about 1,000th of the rate in humans compared to our cousin apes. So I think that, that Blumenbach and Aristotle and Theophrastus and all sorts of people who made the claim that humans are like a domesticated animal are basically right. And as Margaret Mead said, both men and women are naturally ... are relatively unaggressive. Now, what is so fascinating when Margaret Mead says that human aggression is like a domesticated animal, is that human anatomy is like a domesticated animal too. And when Helen Leach put this together a few years ago, what she did was to draw attention to 4 features in particular that differentiate domesticated animals from their wild ancestors. And you can now look at 15 or 20 different species of domesticated animals and see these kinds of trends. Domesticated animals, compared to their ancestors, have a short face, they have smaller teeth, you get feminization of the skull and the skeleton, and you get, very consistently, a reduction in the size of the brain. And humans have all those features, including, remarkably, the fact that in the last 30,000 years, we've undergone a 10 to 15% reduction in brain size compared to those of our wild ancestors. Now, in all of these cases, there are individual interpretations of why this should be. You know, maybe we got small teeth in this phase because we were eating softer foods, or maybe we got a brain reduction because we had a reduction in body weight at the same time, even though our height stayed the same. But what Helen Leach did was to say, if you put all these together, then this looks like a package. And furthermore, the package seems to be related to aggression. So what you see over time is that as you move from the earliest Homo sapiens on the left to something much more modern, you see a trend for these changes to continue, the brow reducing, the face becoming narrower. And let me just draw attention to the face becoming narrower. Men's face width turns out to be correlated with their circulating levels of testosterone. And this is illustrated here by a study which took 20 men who had relatively high testosterone and 20 men who had relatively low testosterone and superimposed photographs together to make the average face. And that's what you see. If you have high testosterone, you're more likely to be a wide-faced man than if you have low testosterone. And guess what? Facial width is correlated with aggression. And one study that really brings this home is one of hockey players. So if you look at hockey players, you can measure their facial width, and then you can see how aggressive they are by how often the referee puts them into the penalty box, the sin bin. And here are data for 6 different professional teams and 6 different college teams which show the same thing. The ones who have the slightly wider faces are the ones who spend more time in the penalty box. So, you know, you can sort of start trying to pull this apart and worry about what's happening here in terms of the data. But here's another piece of data that supports this whole fact that if you present people with photographs of relatively wide-faced or relatively narrow-faced individuals, men, then they will, in test, respond unconsciously as if the ones with wider faces are more likely to be aggressive. This is not true if they're given women's faces. So some human similarities to domesticated animals include the fact that we have a low frequency of aggression, that we've had anatomical changes for the last 300,000 years, which are similar to the changes in domesticated animals, and the males are becoming more female-like, suggesting that we're reducing in the aggression of the sex that is more aggressive. These patterns are rather similar to the ones that we see in this case, wolves compared to dogs. So what is it that is linking aggression and anatomy? We have not known this for many years until we go to Novosibirsk in Siberia and see the wonderful experiment by Dmitri Sobeloff with silver foxes. So Sobeloff was a geneticist who kept quiet during the Stalinist era because it was really dangerous to do Western-type science. His brother was actually murdered by Stalin because he tried to do that. But in the 1950s, he was able to become head of an institute and indulge himself in an experiment he'd long wanted to do, which was to find out if the reason that domesticated animals share various characteristics is because they have been reduced in aggression. So what he did was to start an experiment with foxes in which he chose to breed the foxes that were the least aggressive. The foxes were a good animal to do it from because all over Siberia there were people who were rearing foxes in little mom-and-pop fox fur farms. And he was able to choose out of 400 males the one that was least aggressive. And he did this generation after generation, a very intense selection pressure. He did it by monitoring the young and scoring them for how close they would allow an individual human to get to the fox. So you walk towards the fox and you write down the distance at which the fox says, "Ah!" The closest one is chosen for breeding. Within a few years, there was a new kind of domesticated animal. Some people took them into their homes and treated them as pets. The problem with doing that was that although they were greatly reduced in aggressiveness by this strong selective breeding project, it didn't change their smell. But it did change all sorts of other things as well. And here you see the person who carried on the project after Sobeloff's death, Lyudmila Trut, in the middle, and who began their project with him. And here you see them holding a whole bunch of different foxes, all of which have been domesticated. There were parallel breeding experiments in the same institute with foxes that were not selected for their lack of aggression. Instead, they were selected either for having a lot of aggression, or they just weren't selected at all. So there were some nice controls for what they did. And what they found was that in addition to a very rapid reduction in aggressiveness, which has continued to this day, there were also a lot of unselected consequences of selection for this low reactive aggression. So white patches on the fur are extremely dramatic because we all know that there are white patches on the fur of all sorts of domesticated animals. Dogs and cats and goats and horses and cattle and so on. Not every individual has them. Not every breed has them. But scattered consistently through all of the domesticated animals, you see that happening. Floppy ears, similar. Darwin said, this is such a mystery. Why is it that every species of domesticated animal has got some individuals that have floppy ears, and yet hardly any in the wild? There's only one kind of animal in the wild, he said, that has floppy ears. And you're probably aware that that is an elephant. So these items, these characteristics, white patches and floppy ears, and changes in the bones, and many other things, are traits that we assemble together and we call the domestication syndrome, the syndrome of characteristics that happen when you domesticate an animal. And what Sobeloff and Trut showed in their work with foxes and rats, by the way, and mink, these other animals that came in later, and now people are doing it with chickens and with mice. You select against aggression in captivity, and you get a domestication syndrome. And the domestication syndrome consists of two angles. One is the things that you're directly selecting, the reduction in aggression, which goes along with a reduction in fear, and it goes along with a reduction in the stress response. So those are the selected traits. But then you also get these unselected traits. As I say, it's an unpredictable mixture. Every individual doesn't have all of the characteristics. Every species doesn't have all of the characteristics. But scattered very consistently through the individuals and the populations, you get white patches and floppy ears and curly tails. You get a lot of juvenilization of the features. You get a lot of features that in the ancestral adult would not have appeared, but they're in the ancestral juvenile, and they're retained into adulthood in the subsequent species, such as, by the way, floppy ears, which are juvenile characteristic in many wild animals. And then you get a reduction in face length and the size of the teeth, a reduction in sex differences, which, as I said, is males becoming female-like, not females becoming male-like. And a reduction in brain size. And people are very keen on measuring brain size in the foxes to see, will they be a smaller brain by the time you finish breeding them? So far, it hasn't been definitely shown. There's an interesting wrinkle here, by the way, about the foxes, because when Belyaev started his breeding in 1958, those foxes had in fact already been in captivity since at least the 1920s, and some of them probably about 10 or 15 years earlier, because they came from Canada. And there was a bubble of financial excitement because the fur of silver foxes was incredibly valuable. You could make fortunes with just 2 or 3 animals. So in other words, they were in captivity earlier, and it may be the brain size already got reduced earlier. Anyway, it may be one of those unpredictable things. Still, they certainly show the domestication syndrome in general. Now, I think this has got all sorts of fascinating implications, and let me just mention one of them, which is that what we've seen here is that there is selection against aggression in captivity, and it produces the domestication syndrome. You know, people did not know this until Belyaev came along. People would dream up all sorts of reasons why there were white spots and floppy ears and short tails and all these things in domesticated animals. But it was Belyaev who showed that it was just one thing, selection against aggression. Well, if it's selection against aggression, why does it matter that it's in captivity? Maybe it doesn't. Maybe you can get selection against aggression in the wild, also producing a domestication syndrome. And that idea has been tested. When we compare chimpanzees and bonobos, we compare 2 species very closely related to each other, which have an enormous difference in the amount of fighting and the amount of killing. Chimpanzees are much more aggressive than bonobos. I said earlier that they have roughly the same frequency of aggression. Bonobos are something like half as aggressive in terms of the number of aggressive episodes per day in the wild, according to Martin Serbeck, who's coming here next year to be a professor. But even though the bonobos have a frequency of aggression that is somewhat similar to the chimpanzee, they are much less aggressive in terms of how much they hurt each other. So it turns out to be an astonishing thing that bonobos have the domestication syndrome in their bones. They have a short face, they have smaller teeth, they have a reduction in brain size, and they have reduced sex differences compared to chimpanzees. And it now looks as though we can think of bonobos as a self-domesticated form of a chimpanzee-like ancestor. We know from the genetic evidence that they've been separated for about 1 million years. And in the case of bonobos, we can start imagining why this has happened. Because nowadays, if a male loses his temper and goes completely mad and threatens a female bonobo, then she gives a quick call, and other females rally to her cause, and then they chase the male. And the reason the bonobos are able to do that on a very consistent basis is because they live in an ecology in which females are able to stay together on a very predictable and regular basis, which is not true for the chimpanzees. I think that what this suggests, this is the first case in which it's been really, I think, relatively convincingly argued that bonobos are self-domesticated, or any wild animal is self-domesticated. I'm slightly self-conscious here. I'm part of the team that did this, so I shouldn't sort of make too strong claims for it, I guess. But I think what it means is that there are other species that are going to end up showing the same thing. In fact, my expectation is that you will find in in many different lineages, that there are cases where you can argue that an animal has got relatively low frequency of aggression or relatively low intensity of aggression because of selection against it compared to the ancestor, and therefore that there will be the domestication syndrome. One of the cases in which this, one of the contexts in which this seems likely to happen is on islands, where we know that birds, mammals, and rodents have all been shown to be less aggressive on islands than their continental varieties, and without anyone having done the sort of hard evidence, it looks as though the self-domestication syndrome, the domestication syndrome, pops up quite repeatedly on islands. All of which I think is quite interesting because one of the things it means is that we've got to be very careful thinking that the traits that we see in nature are necessarily adapted. They may be incidental consequences of adaptation for other reasons, coming as a domestication syndrome because of selection against aggression. Now, of course, why is there a domestication syndrome at all? I haven't given even a hint of an answer to that question. We only still have, hints, but my colleagues Adam Wilkins and Tecumseh Fitch and I have explored the idea that the reason that these features are tied together is because of very, very early events in the developing embryo that are necessary to produce the reduction in aggression and have, as incidental consequences, tend to be associated with these other changes. So the selection for tameness goes to reduced stress response, and that is caused, we think, by a reduced migration of these particular cells, the neural crest cells, a tissue that happens just after, is formed just after gastrulation. I mean, in humans, it's between 2 and 3 weeks of age, and then sort of does weird things and kind of disappears. And it will produce, in this case, smaller adrenals, and as an incidental consequence, we know that neural crest cell migration is responsible for producing white patches. We think it's responsible for producing floppy ears. We know it's responsible for producing smaller brains in some experimental animals, and so on. So we don't know yet really exactly what's going on, but there's some fascinating biology starting to tease this apart, and we've now got 6 or 7 species of domesticated animals in which the neural crest cell hypothesis looks pretty good in terms of the genetic changes compared to the wild ancestor. Well, having said that, let me sort of just leave that on, and you can read the book about it. But let me turn to the sort of fascinating question of if humans self-domesticated, how did it happen? And here I want to come back to the problem of aggression and the goodness paradox, the paradox of being, on the one hand, relatively unaggressive, on the other hand, rather aggressive. And the essential solution that is been staring us in the face for decades, actually, is that instead of one type of aggression, which is kind of what's been assumed by people in anthropology and philosophy and many people thinking about this area, there are 2 types of aggression. Well, okay, maybe in the end there'll be more, but 2 types sure seem to characterize or to capture a lot of the variation. So one kind is proactive, instrumental, premeditated, planned variation, and the other is the emotional and reactive. And the point about this is that these are differently controlled in terms of their biology, and therefore they can be on different evolutionary tracks. So reactive aggression is where you suddenly lose your temper when some jerk that you've met in the bar says that your mother is a fill in the blank, which leads to the most common type of murder in the United States, which is 2 strangers meeting outside the bar in the car park and having a fight, and one of them pulls out a knife or a gun. So that's reactive aggression, very highly aroused, and you tend to be angry with everybody around you. Proactive aggression is calmer, it's deliberate. There might be high arousal in dealing with proactive aggression, but in general what's happening is that the individuals or the group has got a consistent aim that they want to solve, to get something or to kill somebody, and once they've done that, then they can finish their aggressive episode. Now, we've seen that humans are very low in reactive aggression compared to chimpanzees, but what about proactive aggression? Well, here is data brought together by Lawrence Keeley some years ago and then added to with our chimpanzee data, And what each column represents is a particular society with a rate of death in intergroup aggression, which in the case of these different human cultures is war. And so what you see is there's a lot of variation among the different cultures, but if you put it all together, the median is somewhere in the sort of 0.4 range, the percent of population killed per year in intergroup aggression, and chimpanzees are in the same order of magnitude as the humans. Incidentally, the industrial societies are interesting here because they include the cases of Germany and Russia and Japan going through World War I and World War II. So even though we think of that as simply appalling death rates, they are actually lower than the estimates for a series of societies and chimpanzees. Well, animals have both proactive and reactive aggression. On the bottom right here, you see an example of an individual that was killed using proactive aggression by the chimpanzees that I study. So our group killed this guy. And a very important feature of proactive aggression is illustrated by what happens when chimpanzees do this. So chimpanzees, on average, 8 individuals kill 1 victim at a time. So that means they have overwhelming power. And the result is that even though you've got a victim who is fighting for his life, and he's 3 or 4 times as strong as a human, he can't touch the ones who are trying to kill him. So in this particular case, this victim was lying there with cuts all over the ventral side of his body. His thorax had been torn out. 1 testicle was under his body, and another one was 5 meters away. And the 8 who attacked him, not one of them had a scratch. That is because one individual can grab a hand, another can grab a foot, and hand and foot. He's immobilized, and the rest can just do the damage. And the point about proactive aggression is that if it's done right, and animals do tend to do it right, the aggressors don't get hurt. So it's very different from reactive aggression in that way, because in reactive aggression, both sides tend to get hurt, but one of them gets hurt worse. Okay, so the proactive and reactive distinction has been known in many ways for some time, but only recently people really got to grips with the neurobiology. They know that it's part of the attack circuit in the brain that is responsible for activating aggression. The amygdala, the hypothalamus, and the periaqueductal gray are different parts of the brain which are all involved. But what turns out to be the case is that in proactive aggression, the particular parts of those subregions of the brain are different from the particular parts that are involved in reactive aggression. That's biology. This is all probably familiar to you from the point of thinking about the law. You know, we know that if a man kills when he finds his wife in bed with another man, then he is likely to be forgiven by a jury in a way that a deliberate, planned, intended aggression is not. So first-degree murder tends to be proactive, and second-degree murder tends to be reactive. And we differentiate those. There are all sorts of ways in which these have been separated. Here we got 5 different areas of science that have distinguished these 2 types of aggression, but it hasn't until now been brought into evolutionary anthropology, this distinction. So what I'm telling you is that it's pretty clear that human aggressiveness can be differentiated between a low propensity for reactive aggression and a high propensity for proactive aggression compared to our relatives. So we can start imagining how these have happened in evolutionary time, with humans having this great difference in terms of the low reactive aggression from our cousin apes, but similar to chimpanzees and less than bonobos with the proactive aggression. I want to focus in my remaining time on the low propensity for reactive aggression. What is it that favored this? And just as we can ask with bonobos, what is it nowadays when you see a male who is too aggressive that stops him from being aggressive? And in that case, it was the females. We can ask what happens in hunters and gatherers when they have to deal with persistent aggressors. Because although hunters and gatherers are famously peaceful, and I've emphasized that point earlier, nevertheless, if you read the ethnographies, you will find some individuals who sometimes just go against the norms. They are people who just won't be stopped. They are jerks, and they are men. So here you've got a tiny little camp where people are living in extremely close quarters all the time. It's a very socially claustrophobic atmosphere. And somebody thinks it's really funny to put rotten eggs in someone else's clothes. Or worse, to grab the meat when somebody comes in with it and take it all for himself and only dish it out to those that he likes. Or to come into someone's hut at night and kick one man out and say, I'm going to sleep with your wife tonight. Or to put an arrow into somebody that he doesn't like. These things happen. And the question is, what do you do about it? And depending on what's happening, of course, these personality traits tend to stay there for some time. The people start out by just cajoling them. They might ostracize them, which is very, very painful if you're living in one of these small communities. Nobody will pay any attention to you. These sorts of things will normally bring him into line. They might ridicule him. Who do you think you are, big boots? Sometimes people might get to the desperate point of just making a plan to walk out in the middle of the night. He wakes up in the next day and he's all on his own. But of course, it's easy enough for him just to track him and join him again. Say, hi. Great. So there's no police, there's no prisons, there's nobody to help except you're just on your own. And what do you do if a guy is a total jerk and in the end just absolutely persists in getting his way? Because he is a physically domineering individual who is prepared to fight anybody. Remember that movie of the chimps? The alpha male chimp is the alpha male so long as he can personally, physically defeat any other chimpanzee in combat. And on the day when he is beaten by one other individual, he is no longer alpha male and he never will be again. But that is a system that happens in all the primates except humans. Individual physical fighting ability won't work. The ultimate sanction in humans is execution. In hunters and gatherers, in every continent of the world, they are known to execute individual men who are too assertive, who use their physical strength to try and bully in the way that a chimpanzee male would. So here's an example from the harmless people, as Elizabeth Marshall Thomas quite rightly called them. That was their name for themselves, the Juhwansi of Southern Africa. A guy he's already killed 3 people, and the community decides to kill him. And it says here, fatally wounded him in full daylight. He died, and then everybody came along and put an arrow into his body. They wanted to symbolically be part of, yeah, we all did it together. And this is fairly typical. Here is Christopher Boehm, who's done all the hard work in reading 120 ethnographies of hunters and gatherers and finding out about the general patterns. The typical domination episode involves a male who seriously intimidates people at the level of lethal threat and then is dispatched. And the interesting thing about his being dispatched by his own male kinsman shows how carefully this is thought out, because what they don't want to do is for A to kill B, and then B's relatives say, well, I know you sort of you needed to do it, but he's our kin, so we're going to have to kill someone on your side. Avoid that revenge scenario by getting the male kin to do the killing in the first place. What is it that differentiates humans from chimpanzees in this respect? I've said already that chimpanzees can kill members of neighboring groups. I showed you a picture of it. They sometimes kill members of their own groups. But what they don't show any evidence of doing is having a plan to kill members of their own groups. And that's tricky. It's tricky to get involved in a fight with people in your own group because you don't know who's going to be an ally on what side. And it's tricky enough with humans. I mean, imagine that you think there's someone in your group who's a real jerk, and you say, wouldn't it be great to send him back to the witches? And so you say to your pal, you know, I think it'd be a great idea to drop a rock on this guy's head in the middle of the night. And the pal says, sure, But then he goes off to the jerk and says, you know what my friend was talking about? He's talking about offing you. In other words, it's a very difficult, problematic scenario. And you need to be able to communicate in very much more sophisticated ways than chimpanzees can. So if we're going to think about what it is that's responsible for humans having this apparently universal tendency, we have to go to not just language, but a sophisticated form of language, which enables a group of men in the group, a subgroup of men, to conspire and form a plan that they are comfortable with. And it's still, tricky nowadays. I mean, when Caesar's assassins came to kill him, they'd been conspiring and planning for weeks. And yet, at the time they were going to do it, there was all of a sudden nervousness about whether or not they could actually go through with it. Because what if you made the first move and then everyone else decided, well, no, we decided to change our minds. And it was two brothers who did it first. It's a tricky business, but if you can organize it, then you move into a world in which you can do it safely. It's just like those chimpanzees killing an individual in a brutal way without any scratch on themselves. That is the way that proactive aggression works in humans. And as a particularly hideous example, think about Auschwitz. Think about the concentration camps, where people were killed in huge numbers, and the killers did not get killed. In the case of our ancestors, starting more than 300,000 years ago, I think we should reconstruct that our species became different from others, our lineage, because language became sufficiently sophisticated that they could have conspiracies leading to the safe, proactive killing of the tyrants, the previous alpha male types. And that led to self-domestication. And then you get a whole series of other things that happen. One of them is that our societies are famously egalitarian, which really means among the males. It doesn't so much mean between the males and the females, I'm sorry to say. But if you look at the social relationships in small-scale societies, it's fiercely egalitarian among the males. No male can exert authority over others. And certainly they can't do it based on physical fighting ability unless they do it for a few weeks at a time before they're executed. Of course, one of the great things about having reduced aggression in the group is that people find it easier to cooperate with each other. And so I think a lot of the cooperation that you see so famously in humans is an incidental consequence of selection against reactive aggression. One of the kinds of cooperation is patriarchal. What you see in small-scale societies is there are a series of rules and laws and religious beliefs and other social norms in which somehow the men come out on top. And if women do the wrong thing, if women, by mistake, see the sacred trumpets of the men or walk on the paths that the men have assigned to be male-only paths, then they can get killed. There is a striking amount of evidence of the exertion of power by the male coalitions, even in the small-scale societies where outright fighting hardly ever happens at all. And like Christopher Boehm, I think that one of the consequences of the power of the men in general is that it is a path into understanding why humans have got moral emotions that differ from the moral emotions that you see in animals. And the big difference is that humans really take choices to invest in the group. Our moral senses are partly self-serving and partly directed towards helping the group aims. Well, imagine in these sort of claustrophobic, dangerous societies, if you are a nonconformist and say, I don't want to do something to help the group, I'll just keep my meat for myself. Well, you do that too often and people start whispering about you, and then the ultimate sanction can come through. Well, the overall points I've been making are twofold. First of all, there is the paradox. How did we evolve to be at both ends of the supposed scale of aggression simultaneously? And what I've argued is that we should be thinking not of a single scale of aggression, but of two. We have reactive aggression, in which we're very much at the low end, and we have proactive aggression, in which we're very much at the high end. We're not quite as bad as wolves, in which something more like 40% of all adults get killed by proactive aggression from other wolves. But nevertheless, we're definitely one of the top species. So that gives a sense of the source of our good and evil, I hope. And then why is it that one species of Homo became sapiens? I think that Freud was right. I only learnt about this this week, this quote from Sigmund Freud, that human life in communities only becomes possible when a number of men unite together in strength superior to any single individual and remain united against all single individuals. That is what no other mammal does. And you need to have a sophisticated form of language to be able to do it. So I think that it's when the mysterious origins of sophisticated language can be better understood that we will understand the solution to those two big problems about why, on the one hand, we are so relatively peaceful, and on the other hand, why we evolved the domestication syndrome. I've focused quite a lot this evening on the parallels with domestication, which I think are just totally intriguing, and I think that it's a really wonderful time to be thinking about this because the genetic revolution is going to give real possibilities for understanding how human changes compared to, not our ancestors, but good models for ancestors, Neanderthals and Denisovans, how those human changes are instantiated compared to the genetic changes in domesticated animals. And already we're beginning to see a little bit of evidence about that. But even though I've been focusing on reactive aggression and how great we are, nobody's fault this evening. Nevertheless, I just want to emphasize in a sort of slightly gloomy way that the mixture does remain. And I think that we need to continue to grapple with the fact that we come from a lineage in which proactive aggression has been very important. And it continues to be a serious threat. The nice news about proactive aggression is that, unlike reactive aggression, individuals are not expected to indulge in it if they are themselves going to get hurt. What that means translated into the big areas of international politics has yet to be worked out. But nevertheless, I think that it's very important to hold in parallel these two ideas, that on the one hand, we're a delightful, tolerant, cooperative, unaggressive species, but on the other hand, our capacity for danger looks very much like something that we've inherited from our great ape ancestry. So with that, I'd just like to acknowledge the fact that I've had huge numbers of people with whom I interact with developing this story. The ones I've put here are the most important ones who have actually been at Harvard during that time. Thank you very much.
And now we have time for some question and answer. I'm going to be running this mic through the audience.
Hi, I was curious as to how much external influences affect aggression. So, for example, an animal's position in the food chain, whether that affects how aggressive they are or the level of the proactive or reactive aggressiveness.
Well, your question draws attention to the fact that even though I've been implying that it's relatively simple to characterize aggressiveness, there are going to be all sorts of influences on it. And one of the influences is that if you look at the relative dominance rank of individuals, you tend to find that the more high-ranking ones are more aggressive than the lower ranking. And probably that's partly a result of their being in the high ranks because they're having to defend themselves, sometimes proactively, against those that might attack them. And it might also be a consequence of their personality, which pushed them up there in the first place. Those sorts of multiple cause-effect relationships are going to be permeating all sorts of different ways in which environmental contexts and social contexts affect aggressiveness. So, I wouldn't want to downplay the importance of those things at all. But at the same time, it's very clear that you can select against aggressiveness in general and affect the species.
Do you think that simply the evolution of language is sufficient to disrupt the stability of the kind of winner-take-all strategy of the lower apes and make it immediately favorable to turn over to this forma posse approach, or do you feel that something else has to be explained in how that transition may have occurred?
Do I think language is the only thing that's necessary, you're saying?
Right, and
yeah.
So can you relate that to, do bonobos form posses to deal with
no.
So that their reduction is reduced, but they don't do this
yeah, so far there's no clear evidence of bonobos showing proactive aggression. So very different from chimpanzees. It's possible they do. At one point, it seemed as though bonobos didn't hunt monkeys. And there seems to be a relationship between hunting animals of other species for prey and hunting members of your own species. Many of the social carnivores do both. Lions do both. Wolves do both. Hyenas do both. Bonobos do neither. Chimps do both. So I think that was just a little subpart of your question. So the language issue. Okay, so do I think that only language is important? Well, the way I would answer that is that I think that if chimpanzees had the linguistic abilities of humans, then they would have capital punishment. So I think that I don't see any hindrance for chimpanzees following down that path in terms of their other abilities. People sometimes say maybe weapons were really important. But I don't think there's any evidence that weapons are particularly important. The capital punishment that hunter-gatherers display, which comes in all sorts of different styles, may or may not use weapons. It sometimes does, in fact, most often does, but it doesn't have to. And it's very likely that, well, in fact, it's certain that humans were using weapons long before 300,000 years ago. So to me, the really important thing is just the ability to coordinate. That, to me, is the single thing that stops chimps from becoming humans, or that stopped Neanderthals from becoming sapiens.
I'm hustling.
Thank you. So one of the things that really struck me from that talk was when you mentioned the 10 to 15 reduction in brain size. Does that correlate with a reduction in direct intelligence, given that these proto-humans no longer need to be able to think really quickly to outwit opponents physically all the time? And if we were to return to a state of nature, would we become individually more intelligent?
So that's a fun question, and probably you have come across the cautionary remark that people often make, saying, don't equate brain size with intelligence. And this seems to be one of the cases in which it's very important to follow that caution. Because when people have done deliberate tests to assess the problem-solving ability of domesticated animals and their wild ancestors, you can find some differences in the way they solve problems. But overall, I think that you cannot say that there is any loss of problem-solving ability in the smaller brain descendants. And one particularly nice set of studies is with guinea pigs and their KV ancestors, because you can bring them up in numbers and in conditions which really satisfy the need for good controls. I think what's going on, just sort of speculating a bit about the brain size, is that this is part of juvenilization. So my own sort of personal thinking is that the easiest target of selection when you're selecting against reactive aggression is to select for younger individuals, because juveniles are less fierce than adults in terms of their emotional responses to being insulted. And that, as a consequence of that, there is selection in favor of individuals whose emotional responses are relatively juvenilized, and that goes along with a more juvenile style of brain. And in humans nowadays, I don't think if you take a 10-year-old that they're any less good at solving problems probably than adults. I don't know, maybe there's some cognitive psychologists here who will shoot me down on that. But at any rate, my sense is that we should not look to brain size to assess intelligence. The other question that you asked at the end was, if we went back to the wild, I think you put it, then would our brains get bigger again? And so far, what has happened is that this is an example of what people call Dollo's law, which is that once you get domesticated and you have a smaller brain, then your brain size stays small. And one wonderful example is the American mink. So American minks were domesticated in 80 generations, and they showed the domestication syndrome and had small brains. And then at the end of that time, they were, during that time, I guess a little bit, they were taken to Europe, and they've now spread into, I think, 13, something like that, European countries in the wild. And they have done better than the wild European species that are most closely related to them. And they've lived at their expense. And those American mink have not lost any have not regained any brain size since then. And the similar things are true for the dingo in Australia, a descendant of a domesticated dog that now lives in the wild, but retains a small brain, and feral goats and feral pigs. So it doesn't look as though it's particularly a bad thing, having a smaller brain. And I'm tempted to think that the reason that some species have, like humans, have males with slightly bigger brains than females has nothing to do with problem-solving ability. It's to do with aggression. And if you select against aggression, then you get a smaller brain size. This explains why bonobos, there's no difference in brain size between the sexes, whereas chimps, the males have bigger brains than the females, and so on. Shouldn't have pressed that button. Brains are too much fun.
Thank you for a fascinating talk. I'd like to explore a little bit human domestication. I think it's really important, the difference between chimpanzees and humans, the reduction in the number of chromosomal pairs was accompanied by concealed ovulation in humans.
Can you hold the microphone closer?
And concealed ovulation in humans gives the female a tremendous amount of agency in terms of selecting for males, and particularly selecting for males who are not aggressive. So could you talk a little bit about the role of females in domesticating humans in terms of the choices they made? Because female choice is a strong selective pressure in humans.
Yeah, thank you for giving me that opportunity. So a number of people have written that female choice is probably quite important in domesticating humans. The reason I didn't talk about it is that it seems to me that it's a secondary component, because if a male is a real bully and just insists on getting his way, female choice becomes very, very diminished in its power. And the reason I say that is sort of partly just simple logic, but from what we see with chimpanzees. So, I know humans are not chimpanzees, so we shouldn't use that model too much. But here's what happens with chimps. The males attack females in a kind of personal way. So each male will have a particular female that he attacks more than any other male does. Maybe he'll have 2 or 3 females, depending on the male. And it turns out that the male who attacks a female more than any other male has a greater than 50% chance of being the father of her next offspring. And these attacks are not just when she is sexually receptive, but even leading up to that, in 2 or 3 years before. So what that rather horrifyingly says to me is that if we can imagine ourselves back into a world when we're not nice like we are now, but when the males were real bullies, like the chimpanzees are, that female choice would have been much less effective. And I agree with you that nowadays we should pay more attention to the ability of women to be able to choose either overtly or covertly, as you're applying from the concealed estrus. But that's not going to happen until we've got a long way down the path of domesticating the males.
Hi. My question is about the aggression. So the two forms, like the proactive and the reactive, or the human seems to have like favored the proactive form of aggression. And if all forms of aggression somehow like come from testosterone, how come, like for example, there's a reduction in the form of testosterone in humans, since like still like proactive aggression is still a form of aggression?
Well, I think what you're drawing attention to is the fact that proactive and reactive aggression are on different evolutionary tracks, and their relationship to testosterone is quite different. You know, we know that testosterone is intimately involved in the expression of reactive aggression. It just so happens that it is less important in the generation of proactive aggression. And in general, we know less about the neurobiology of proactive aggression than reactive aggression. I think it's a great tragedy because proactive aggression is in many ways much more important in the human species. You know, not just in terms of the deaths that are caused in war, but much more subtly. In the book, I sort of go into thinking about how proactive aggression in many ways underlies the smooth functioning of state societies through the operation of police and so on. So proactive aggression is hugely important, but it does not have the predictable set of neurobiological relationships that reactive aggression has. And you asked me, you know, if testosterone is declined, as indicated by the changes in brow ridges and facial shape in Homo Sapiens, why hasn't it been responsible for a reduction in proactive aggression? Well, because that's just not the way the biology works. And finding out more about how it works is going to be a really exciting challenge.
Okay, we have time for about one or two more questions.
So all of this that you presented is really predicated on this fact that men are, or males are, more physically aggressive than females. So I had, I guess, kind of two levels of question. The first is, if you're looking within then just the females of the population, do you expect this sort of testosterone and proactive reactive aggression difference to track also within females? So like females that have higher testosterone demonstrating more reactive aggression? And then also, are there circumstances in which there are populations where females are more aggressive, and how does that kind of play out?
Well, there are certainly populations of humans in which females are relatively aggressive compared to other populations. There are lots of social influences. I mean, in general, what you find is that the societies in which people are strikingly peaceful at a relatively early age, you know, in adolescence and going on, are societies in which the expression of aggression is rigorously controlled by the adults in the young. You know, they really beat the aggression out of them, or have other kinds of ways of doing that. So, you know, again, I appreciate the question because it enables me to emphasize the fact that there are all these cultural influences on the expression of aggression. As far as the relationship between testosterone and female aggressiveness, the testosterone levels are so much lower in humans, in women, than in men, that it's relatively difficult to establish those sorts of studies. And the net result is, A, that there are fewer studies, and B, I'm not in a position to answer them.
Hi, thank you for the interesting talk. So in one of your slides, you showed pretty much a chain reaction of events that started with humans having sophisticated language and then pretty much ended with males cooperating with each other, and then kind of suggests that that's the reason why male dominated in today's society. So is there a reason why females do not kind of are unable to cooperate with each other in a similar fashion?
Well, so the question is why females don't nowadays cooperate with each other as much as males do. Is that right?
It's more of the like, is there an explanation why females do not cooperate with each other, and possibly we have a more female-dominated society rather than a male-dominated society?
So this is a huge question about contemporary politics and so on, about why females don't dominate some societies, such as our own, in the way that males do. Is that right?
Yes.
Yeah. And I don't think we have really satisfactory answers to that. I think that it's pretty clear that we can go back to the past and understand the relatively simple dynamics of males dominating access through this incredibly crude mechanism originally of ultimately execution. And they had, as a small group, the ability to dominate anybody in the group. They could, once they'd got that power, they could kill any male who was a nonconformist. They could kill any female they wanted to. They had the power among themselves. Why couldn't females do the same sort of thing? And there are many myths in different societies around the world talking about a struggle between the females and the males. And the females get together and try and usurp power, just in the way that you're saying. And then there was a fight between the males and the females. I think the easiest interpretation of that is that the males always characterize it as a time of chaos when the females were trying to run things. And it justifies them in maintaining male supremacy. So did that actually happen? That females in some societies came together and tried to cooperate with each other? We don't know. But there are very intriguing indications that the style of cooperation among men differs from the style of cooperation among women in ways that may mean that it is harder for women to form large groups. And the book that I would refer you to for that is called Warriors and Warriors by Joyce Benenson, who is here in the audience somewhere, I think. It explores the notion that our evolutionary history has had slightly different consequences for the evolutionary psychology of men and women, such that they can each cooperate equally well, but the style of cooperation is that women tend to cooperate in relatively intense ways with smaller groups, more like kin groups, whereas men tend to cooperate in shallower ways with wider groups. So that's just one more question, which I think is going to be able to be answered in the future much better than we can right now. Thank you very much.